everyone, I'm Georgia.
And I'm Anna.
And we're your two hosts today for episode number 4 of the Kids Cancer Therapy Toolbox. Today we're joined by Dr. Lou Stancato, a guest at the CCTDI Nano course and an expert in pediatric oncology.
We'll be discussing Lou's career and then asking him about key differences between pediatric and adult cancers, including the differences in funding.
So before your retirement in 2023, you worked at Eli Lilly and Company for 26 years. Could you tell us a bit about your work there, specifically the Cancer Drug Development Program?
Sure. First off, thanks for inviting me to this. I'm very excited to share with you what I've learned over the past 30 years in this space. So at Lilly, I worked literally from the beginning to the end of drug discovery and development. I think it's safe to say I've seen most aspects of how a drug goes from concept all the way to clinic to the market. About halfway through, I started working on pediatric cancer and looking to see where our drugs that were being developed for adults could fit in with children. And as a result, a number of clinical trials were initiated, some of which continue even after I retired, and some of which are occurring outside the walls of Lilly through collaborations with scientists at institutes around the country and even around the world.
So, from the many accomplishments of your career, which one are you the most proud of or find the most impactful today?
Probably the one called ITCCP4, which it's an odd-sounding name. It was a consortium of 10 large pharmaceutical companies and 20 institutes spread out across the European Union, where we came together to create a pediatric research platform because nothing like that existed. If adult cancer researchers wanted to look at colon cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, they could turn to any number of companies or even academic institutes, and there would be tons of models, animal models primarily, to work with. Nothing like that existed at the time. That was about 2015, 2016. Nothing like that existed for kids with cancer. Kids are always at a deficit. They've been at a deficit as far as the models, the money that goes in, etc. And we knew that if we wanted to make a difference, we're going to have to band together to form this consortium. And it took about 7 years to do it. COVID, which has interrupted so many people's lives, as you well know, also interrupted our progress. But in the end, we were able to build something that we're very proud of that is now available worldwide to all researchers. And it really fills a gap that was a glaring need in the pediatric research community. So for a number of reasons, the collaborations we established, the friendships I made, the progress we made in the pediatric space lives on. It's now actually a non-for-profit company headquartered in a city called Heidelberg, Germany, and I'm still involved with it. And it's something I never would have imagined I would have been able to do, and I had the privilege of co-leading it with just a wonderful human being named Stefan Pfister, who essentially heads what would be the equivalent to the National Cancer Institute in the United States. He heads the pediatric side of that in Germany, and he's just an amazing human being. So that would probably be the thing I'll look back on with most satisfaction.
You co-led the the Innovative Medicines Initiative. How did that blossom into ITCCP4?
So the Innovative Medicines Initiative, or IMI, was a big blanket organization that the European Union, their governing body, funded. So they're kind of ahead of the United States.
Okay.
They think about, they're just further along in their thinking about pediatric cancer and how to fund research and tackle questions of human health, and they're willing to throw money in differently from how it's done in the United States. So I was approached to put together an IMI project, and that ultimately led to ITCCP4. So we had to conceive of it, design it, sell it to pharma, and then go travel across the EU to gather support. And that's ultimately how that ITCCP4 was developed.
Okay.
So you also serve on some different advisory boards, and one of them is the Scientific Advisory Board of ITCCP4 GGMBH.
That's the nonprofit that resulted from the work we put together over so many years.
How did you choose that name? Just curious.
So the academic group that we ultimately partnered with was affiliated with a European group called ITCC, Innovative Therapies for Children with Cancer. It's a huge umbrella organization in the EU. The P4 is Preclinical Pediatric Proof of Concept Platform. Put them together, you get ITCC P4. That whole GGMBH is just a German designation for a nonprofit.
Okay.
So since we already had the name recognition, people knew who we were. We'd given talks around the world, literally, all corners of the globe kind of thing. We thought we'd keep that name, and there you go. So there was a question in there about advisory boards, I think.
Yeah, so how does advising differ from direct research?
It's an interesting question because they are so different. So advising takes into account everything one has learned along the way and then applying it to other people's problems, other people's research to say, okay, I've seen this, so I think you should do the following, as opposed to managing and leading one's own research where you're literally involved day to day looking at the data, etc. So it's like a higher level association with the scientific progress, where you kind of guide at a higher level and then they take that guidance and reduce it down to practice, as opposed to in one's own lab or one's own research where everything you do is reduced to practice. It's at the most basic level. It's the science you're doing. So it's very different. It's more guiding, leading at a very high level versus being in the weeds doing your own work. They're both very exciting. The advisory board work, it's kind of a recognition that one's career has moved along in a way that others deem desirable and useful, and they want to learn from you. And I think any good scientist, as you go along, should want to give back to the scientific community. That's one way to do it, is take your experience and translate it and provide it to others.
Yeah, so which one do you personally prefer?
I still like the research the best.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you why, because I hope maybe somebody listening will understand this, or it will resonate with them. Because when scientists fail a lot, right? We fail a lot in research, and we can discuss what failure means, but quite often we don't get answers that either we expect or we think, and they may lead us in a direction that we're hoping not to go in, like, oh, this drug doesn't work, whatever. But it's those moments when things all come together and give you a piece of information that is just so astonishing and so exciting, and you're probably the only person in the world, along with whoever's next to you, looking at it. There's no greater feeling than that. That is why I have stayed a scientist for, 30-some years. So I love directing and leading and having people think I know something to the point where they want to listen and learn, but it's really, I still like the nitty-gritty, down-low science.
That's fantastic. Now we'll kind of dive into pediatric versus adult cancers, and we just have a few questions. Mm-hmm. So what would you say the key biological or genetic differences are between childhood and adult cancers?
First off, kids quite often, almost, I won't say completely, but the vast majority, get cancer because of bad luck. It's just bad luck of genes involved with development. There's a process called epigenetics that turn genes on and off, especially during development. So pediatric cancer is very much a disease of bad things happening in those spaces, versus adults. We live in an industrial society. We don't always do the best things for our bodies, to our bodies, etc. All of that stuff adds up to a completely different set of events that lead to cancer. By and large, adults, I'd say 80-85% of them don't have a genetic component per se. It's not like a cancer predisposition syndrome where you're born with it. That's similar to a child. Quite often they're born with it. Most adults, the The majority get cancer because of things in the environment, environmental factors, things we've done to ourselves. So that they manifest very differently, and they need to be treated very, very differently.
So, talking about treatment, how do those differences affect the development of the therapies?
Well, for adults, all the money goes into adult treatment. Let's face it, the majority of funding from any source that's governmental or even private, like as in like pharmaceutical, is into adult therapy. And the kids always get the hand-me-downs from the adult treatment. So drugs that are developed for adult cancers that we might think have an association in pediatric cancers, then perhaps they'll be tested. But what kids really need are drugs tested specifically for their disease. And too little of that is happening. And did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
You kind of already touched on this, but are there any unique challenges in developing therapy specifically for pediatric cancers?
Well, one of the challenges is, yes, we want to save their lives at all costs, but there are costs. And so with adults who's, you're only looking at, I don't know how many years. Well, I actually showed a slide today during my presentation that showed that for the big adult cancers, and those are prostate, colon, breast, and lung, we may give people a decade, 2 decades of life, but quite often that's what's lost when they die from their cancer, and we might give them back a few years, quite often a few months. But with kids, what's lost are decades, like 50, 60, I think. The average loss of life for a child with cancer is something like 68 years. It's astounding. And so where was your question again?
Just unique challenges.
So
yeah.
You got to think, we can save kids' lives. We can give them back decades, we hope. But in doing so, by bombarding them with a lot of the poisons, the chemotherapies, because that's what they are. They're really poisons. It's not like we want to do this. We know it works for them. What happens is we save their lives, but we set them up for a lifetime of other medical problems. And there's all kinds of information and data out there that, like, a kid who had cancer who survives, and in their 20s they have the body of a late 40 to early 50-year-old. They start getting things begin to break down that would otherwise not happen except through time. So one of the big challenges is, how do we give this kid life, a child life, but with the quality they deserve, and prevent these kind of things? So like when you treat adults, so I'm saying they may be losing a decade or two by and large when they get some of these cancers. What we end up giving them back, in some cases, we cure them, and you don't worry so much about what effect you've had on them because they're closer to the end than the beginning. It's the flip, it's the opposite for kids. They're closer to the beginning than the end. So it becomes even more paramount, more urgent to find better, less toxic therapies for them. I'm not saying adults don't deserve that, please. I hope nobody thinks that. It's just, you have to look at it. 68 years of life lost versus 10, 15, whatever. I don't know what it may be, except the money is spent in the complete opposite direction. All the money goes to giving people months, whereas we should be giving more money to giving children decades, and better decades at that.
Yeah. So how does a small patient population impact the speed and the scope of clinical trials for childhood cancer?
Definitely affects it, because quite often, think about it, adults can take themselves by and large to their chemotherapy appointments, to their doctor appointments. Kids don't have that luxury. They have to be driven, they have to be taken, they need support. Sometimes they want mom, sometimes they want dad, sometimes they want both. They have to go where the trials are. Unlike adult trials, which are probably spread out, or I shouldn't say spread out, they're more easily found around the country. The pediatric trials often are run out of a few centers, and those centers may be hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles from where the child lives. So they have to get there. So these centers have to figure out a way to get these kids there, and it's definitely quite difficult. Plus, parents don't necessarily know where to turn. I don't know of a good, I don't know what to call it, like a clearinghouse or a website that tells you about where all the pediatric clinical trials are and for what kind of therapy, whatever. So you have the problem of fewer centers, more dispersed, fewer patients. It gets to be difficult. It can be difficult to run that trial. And unfortunately, I think things are changing. The way the rules are with the FDA, they still kind of hold to old values of how to run clinical trials and assess clinical data. You know, when kids are dying, like Charles was talking about, one of the drugs CCTDI is working on, one of the diseases, DIPG, which essentially has a 0% survival rate. You need to look at that different clinically, how to go after a trial. Do we need controls? Do we need what, or can we just look at the fact that these kids almost invariably die and just take any improvement, any advancement as that, an advancement, and move that drug forward? Versus with adults, you got to run hundreds of patients, you got to have control arms and this and that. With kids, you need a different approach. So you need a different approach on top of fewer subjects who have to travel a lot further than adult patients. So it's just a lot more complicated, a lot more involved, and it's debilitating for the families, or it can be.
Could you see a tool for locating clinical trials being developed?
I can't believe, I know one can go on clinicaltrials.gov, but that, I don't know if that's good enough. And the average person, non-science based, although parents of kids with children are amazing in what they can learn and do in a short period of time. But there has to be something that brings all of this together and presents it in a better way. I'm just not aware of it. And if there isn't something, I think we could use a tool like that.
Yeah. Do you think there's like a difference between younger children and older children when approaching those cancer treatments?
Some, yes. So we were talking about this today. One of the things about like an adult drug then being turned around and used in a child is that you have to have a formulation, a way to get it to the child. Kids can't swallow big pills. And you can debate at what age is it okay for a kid to swallow a pill, but by and large, kids don't really like to swallow pills, especially your 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, like your neuroblastoma kids. But maybe the adult drug is a pill. What do you do then? You got to figure out a way to give it in smaller pills, or you create a sachet. There are things like they put it on the ice cream for kids, and etc. So it's very complicated to turn around and take an adult drug and give it to a child. It's not as easy and straightforward as one would like it to be. So your question again?
I just asked for like older teenagers
so
versus younger kids.
So the older ones, sorry, my brain's,
No, you're
it's
good.
been a long
You're
day,
good,
so
yeah.
I hope I'm being clear enough.
No, you are.
The older kids, actually, this is pretty interesting. There is a change occurring, and this goes back to one of your previous questions. There is a change occurring where now children 12 years old and greater are increasingly being enrolled in adult clinical trials, because by then most of the developmental processes that are thought to be affected by a lot of the drugs that are being researched in adults are probably less likely to be affected. They're almost little adults by the time you hit 12. Now we can argue what that means, but it's really to the benefit, I think, of children at that age to be able to get into those adult trials, because then they're going to have access to potential care that they would not otherwise have had. Versus the little ones, the only way to do the trials with the little ones is to do the trials with the little ones. But again, you have to be able to give them the drug. And a lot of companies are hesitant to do that because it's super expensive. And just silly things like some of these drugs taste awful. So if you take it out of a pill and you make the liquid formulation, you're like, here, drink this, The kid is not going to, a little kid is not going to care. They're not going to understand that, oh, if I drink this might save my life. They don't get that. They can't conceptualize that. They just know that this stuff tastes awful. And I don't want to taste that. I don't want to drink that. Versus the older kids, you can reason with them, and quite often you can get them into the formulations where they can avoid the taste. Or maybe they can avoid, well, they can handle a bigger pill. Things like that. So those are some very stark differences, if you will, between the younger and the older. And then, there are subtleties based on the type of disease, whatever. And but to me, those are like sort of our main differences, big differences.
Do parents have feelings about enrolling their kids in these clinical trials? Like, what would you say is their greatest kind of concern?
I guess it depends. I've had this conversation now. I'm a parent. I've had 3 children, or my wife, we have, but unfortunately, we never had to face this. If you're faced with a kid who has relapse refractory disease, meaning it's pretty much spread, the chances are not good of a favorable outcome. So the people I've spoken with are like, they're just amazing in their belief and their views that, well, we'll try the trial. We don't have a lot of hope, but we hope that we learn something from the trial that will help somebody else. I mean, it's just an incredibly generous spirit and way of thinking of these parents. But then there are also some cases where there is hope. Like, hey, we do have this new therapy out there. Do you want to try it? But then the problem is you might have to try that therapy to the exclusion of other therapies that have been shown to perhaps be effective. So what do? I've got a 25% chance of my child surviving going on this regimen, this series of drugs, and probably a 75% chance that they're going to have long-term effects, but they'll still be alive, versus this is wholly unproven and I don't get to try some of these drugs. So it's very complicated. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question. It depends on so many things: the type of disease, how effective the standard of care is, what's the new therapy, what's the kid's tumor look like at the molecular level. So it's very complicated. But parents will now more than ever they'll do the research and they'll make the most informed decision possible.
Are there any dangers to the kids within the clinical trials?
Always.
Okay.
100%. Especially since kids, by and large, can handle higher doses of drugs than adults. Like, if there's an adult drug, whatever it may be, and then you want to test it in a child, they start testing it at about 75-80% of the adult dose, and often go above the adult dose because the kid can handle it. It doesn't take much thought to realize, well, that could lead to a bad outcome. But yeah, in some of these drugs, you just don't always know. You can just look at some of the gene therapy things that have occurred lately in the muscular dystrophy world, where patients have died. I mean, these are people who are going to probably die from their disease, but they're dying even earlier. There's just been, there's always the potential for harm, not through anyone's omission or a willful act, just because you're introducing things into the body that aren't meant to be there, and you're trying to shut down something, and sometimes there are unintended consequences. You shut down things that are important. You just can't know. That's why you have to have numbers. So that goes back to your question before about, well, having few pediatric patients or fewer. That can be a problem because you can't get, you only get a small sampling. So some of these things may crop up down the road, and then people will say, well, this never happened in the past. Well, it's like, we only had 25 kids to prove this on. If we had 250, it might be a different story. That's why you need hundreds or thousands like in the adult world, but you don't have that luxury in the pediatric world.
So moving on to funding, which you talked a little bit about earlier, we were saying pediatric cancers receive a fraction of federal research funding compared to adult cancers. So could you talk more about that disparity?
In what way? Specifically what? Like why, or?
Why has there always been such a large gap?
From the federal government, I'm still not quite sure. Like, now it's $1 out of every $10 that the National Cancer Institute releases or funds goes to pediatrics. 10 years prior, it was $1 out of every 25. So it's changing, but by and large, I think it's just a numbers game. At the end of the day, pediatric cancer is still considered a rare disease, and so it gets shortchanged. But again, think about it in terms of the kids losing upwards of 70 years on average of life versus people losing like 5 or 10. So for every, it's not a 1-to-1 comparison. It's not like one life for one life. It's kind of like, all right, 10 years for 70 years. It's almost like a 7-to-1 comparison if you think about it, but nobody really thinks about it that way. And frankly, the adult cancer lobbying groups are really strong. Everybody knows about breast cancer awareness, and I'm not saying that's bad. I've lost family members to breast cancer. But I bet you can think of times where you've seen advertisements and you've seen the pink ribbons, like they know how to mobilize. The pediatric world hasn't mobilized well enough like they have for prostate cancer, where people shave and they call it Movember, I think it is, and for breast cancer and colon cancer with the NFL, like all these larger, well-known, adult-centric organizations have picked up on this and taken up the cause. Well, who's doing it for pediatric cancer? Sure, we get a gold ribbon in September, but what else do we get? Why? It needs to be more vocal. And I think that's starting to happen, and I think it's going to happen more and more with the moms and the dads who've started these foundations after they've lost children. They're starting to work together more and more, and I'm hoping their voice gets heard. Now, from a pharmaceutical point of view, there's no money in it. No big pharmaceutical company is going to make money selling drugs for kids with cancer. It's at least not the kind of money they want to make, because it's just as expensive, if not more, to make a drug for a kid than it is for an adult. They're never going to get that back. And at the end of the day, every company, by and large, cares about one thing: turning a profit for the people who own them, which are their shareholders. So that's the easiest one of all. There's no money in it, so the kids get shortchanged. And that's across most diseases. There are a few like atopic dermatitis where it's more kids than adults, so everybody's all on that one. All kinds of research there. But by and large, you're talking about a rare disease. Companies don't see how they're going to make money, so they do the minimum at most.
How specifically does that limited funding affect early stages of research or the ability to bring therapies from the lab to the clinic?
Tremendously. There's less money around to take these ideas and turn them into something bigger, like a drug. And maybe this goes beyond the scope of what you two or you listeners want to talk about, but frankly, it's the reward system across the board in the academic labs, so in universities and in companies. People who work on pediatric stuff always take second place to those who don't. So your career, I hate to say it, careers are kind of slowed up. I mean, I had a great career in my first job. Great career, wonderful company, everything was great. And I ended up beyond where I ever thought I would, but I still ended up probably a step below where I should have, because I decided to go off into pediatric land, and I hate to say it, there's no glory there. To me, that's where all the glory is. I'd rather save a kid's life than, get promoted because I did some other things in the adult world. Yes, I would love to help people, but I really want to help kids. Unfortunately, the reward system isn't really designed that way. NIH grants, you don't get as much money. They're not as fundable. It's a messed up system. Sorry, it's kind of sobering, I know.
So are there any policy changes, like with the government, that you think would improve outcomes for
They've
kids?
started. So these changes have started. There was the Race for Children Act, which led directly to these so-called priority review vouchers, where if a company developed a drug for the first indication on the market, so the first use of it, in pediatrics, in anything, they would get a voucher from the Food and Drug Administration that gave them a 6-month review time, no questions asked. Why does that matter? Because sometimes these review times take years. Or let's say you're in hot competition with company Y for a $5 billion drug, and you guys are neck and neck, and you're both going to go to FDA at the same time. You give the voucher, FDA has to act on your drug within 6 months. So that was very sought after, and so people were starting to do more pediatric development. Not necessarily in cancer, but the hope was more would occur in that space. That went away with the current administration and all the changes to Medicare and Medicaid, or mostly to Medicaid. It's just a travesty. It's ridiculous, but it went away. And so should the government do more? Yeah, but we talked about it today. The regulators say you have to do this, this, and this, but the companies figure out ways to go around it because there are loopholes. And these loopholes are exploited because at the end of the day, the companies just want to get that adult indication taken care of. So yeah, the regulatory bodies, the government, could be a little bit tougher on things. And I think they should be. But that leads to legal battles and fights, and in the end, nobody really wants those.
So, what do you think the most effective methods of funding are?
For pediatric cancer?
Yeah.
The government has to play a part, but I think like you see where the donations come from for CCTDI, or where I work at the Indiana Biosciences Research Institute. Donors, people who understand that the current system is broken, or actually it was never even really set up to be successful, but they know something needs to be done. And so it's often people who have lost a child tragically, or they've seen somebody else lose a child, and their life has been good and they've made lots of money and they want to give back. That's a big part of it. The government has to be a big part of it as well. And then the companies, some companies actually give money directly. There are some out there that have social, like justice funds and things where they have to invest in like this. But by and large, the companies aren't going to give a whole lot of money, but maybe they'll give support through know-how, through expertise. But by and large, money from philanthropy, from the government, those are your two biggies, I think, for pediatric cancer. But somehow we have to put it all together to stretch those dollars, at least for now.
Okay, to end on kind of a brighter question, what is one piece of advice you would give to students hoping to go into cancer research or just medical research in general?
Do not let failure or perceived failure get in your way. What you're about to do, what you're going into, is going to be difficult. You're going to hit lots of roadblocks. You're going to hit times where you're like, why am I doing this? This isn't working. You got to keep fighting through it and keep looking for workarounds and showing grit and determination, and you will be rewarded with what I told you earlier. The ability to see something that nobody else sees and knowing that you're making an advance, no matter how small or incremental it may be. It's an advance that leads to the next thing, to the next thing. If that's the kind of stuff that drives you and excites you, go for it.
Okay, thank you so much for answering all our questions and coming on the podcast.
You're welcome. This was fun.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.